The presidential race looks different now than it did a few months ago. With President Biden becoming the first president since 1968 and the 8th overall to leave the race, the campaign has changed, not just for Democrats, now led by Vice President Kamala Harris and her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, but for the Republican ticket of former President Donald Trump and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. Democrats are more energized and polls are reflecting stronger support, and Republicans are trying to hold earlier leads and are increasingly on the offensive. While it's likely Ohio will still end up in the GOP's column, this could have a big impact on down-ticket races such as the U.S. Senate race and the few competitive congressional races. This week I talked with Kyle Kondik, managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, the newsletter from the University of Virginia Center for Politics, which analyzes campaigns and elections. He is also an Ohio native.
So in this week's Crystal Ball, there's this line. In the few weeks that Vice President Kamala Harris has emerged as Democrat standard bearer, she has reset the electoral map to some degree, as she has polled better than President Biden was performing before he ended his campaign. So you got new polls that are showing that she and Donald Trump are locked in tight races in key swing states. And I'm just wondering, has the race fundamentally changed here with the departure of Biden and with Harris then taking over in that role?
The tricky thing about all this analysis is that, I wish we could run the election in a lab experiment and simulate it under different situations and everything. You could figure out like what the different variables are. Like, it's possible that if Biden had stayed in the race, he still would have been able to consolidate the Democrats and made this thing back into a 50-50 race, although it's possible that he couldn't. But what has indeed happened is that Harris is in, Biden is out, and Harris has consolidated Democrats in ways that the party frankly needed to. And Harris now is probably leads in the national polls by some small degree, and also seems to be leading basically in enough states to win the presidency. But her leads are so small that I think the race is still fairly characterized as a toss-up. So in some ways, you could argue that particularly in the depths that Biden reached after the first debate, that Trump had sort of moved into a leading position. Now I think it's more 50-50, and then we're looking ahead to the Democratic National Convention and trying to answer the questions of whether Harris can improve her numbers a little bit more, because if she does, she might actually move into a favored position, as we get to Labor Day.
And Labor Day is typically the time of the year where I think we start talking about the election and everybody starts getting involved, not just political geeks. Is it too early to be expecting that she could, because Biden was losing to Trump in many key polls, is it too early to be talking about who's going to win this thing?
It very well could be. And, my sort of just basic, we just have close elections in the United States, generally speaking. We've seen, this was set up to be a rematch between Biden and Trump. Now there's a new candidate, Harris, but Trump is on the ballot for the third straight time. I don't know if you'd expect Trump to do dramatically different than he did in 2016 and 2020. I think you'd still expect to see the same basic patterns. I think it's just going to be kind of another form of what happened in 2016 and 2020. And those both ended up being really close races in the key states in the Electoral College. Trump won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by less than a point apiece. And that was the difference between him winning and Hillary Clinton winning that election. And then in 2020, the decisive states that allowed Joe Biden to get to an electoral college majority were, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Biden won all those states by less than a percentage point. So I think we should expect this thing to remain close and competitive. And even if Harris were to go ahead in the polls, I wouldn't necessarily think of her as some sort of huge favorite, because again, you could go back to 2016 and 2020 and find certainly large segments of that election where both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden looked like really significant favorites, then it ended up being really close at the end. So I think we should just approach this with some caution. But again, for Democrats who were despondent back in June and July, the situation does look better.
Is this really going to come down to those key swing states, which are primarily Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin? Is it really going to come down to just those, and specifically those blue wall states?
Yeah, I think so. And I would add a seventh state to that in North Carolina, That was Donald Trump's closest win in 2020. And then those 6 other states were all Biden's closest wins, states that he won, but where he did worse than his 4.5-point margin in the national popular vote in 2020. In our ratings, our electoral college ratings, we have those 7 states. The 6 you mentioned are toss-ups. We have North Carolina's leans Republican. We have a single electoral vote in Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. Nebraska and Maine award electoral votes by congressional district. Every other state is winner take all. And those are the only states we have in either toss-up or leans, meaning the rest of the country we have rated as either likely or safe Democratic or likely or safe Republican. When Biden was at his weakest point, it looked like maybe New Hampshire was close, Minnesota was close, Virginia was close, all states where Biden did, won by high single or even low double digits in the case of Virginia. But I think Harris has sort of stabilized the position in the states that weren't super competitive in 2020 and has really refocused the election again on these 7 key swing states and maybe that single electoral vote in Nebraska's 2nd district.
There are issues where voters say they prefer Trump, voters prefer Harris on other issues. Which issues are going to be critical? Is it still immigration and the economy, or are there other issues that are starting to come forward that you think are going to be key here?
Donald Trump still has an advantage, generally speaking, on the economy. I think a lot of that is just kind of sour feelings about inflation. Now, Harris, not actually being the incumbent may allow her to maybe distance herself from the administration's problems on that issue. Of course, Republicans they're going to do their best to try to not let her do that. Immigration, Trump has a much bigger or a bigger advantage on that particular issue. And I think we've seen that Democrats are kind of trying to move to the right to sort of address that particular issue. I think the tone of the immigration talk from Harris now is certainly different than what you would have heard during the 2020 primary season. So again, Republicans are going to try to pin her down to older positions that she has, and she's going to try to run as more of a as a harder edge person on border security. I think if the election is really about people's sour taste about the economy and immigration, that's great for Trump. But there's all sorts of other issues too. I mean, abortion rights is a big advantage for Kamala Harris and the Democrats. I think there continues to be kind of just sort of personal concerns that voters have about Donald Trump's fitness for office. January 6th and those sorts of things kind of play into that. So it's, our elections are, they're based on issues, but a lot of them are kind of cultural too, and personality driven. And, all of those things are going to go into people's choices. And, the voters who are truly persuadable, first of all, there aren't that many of them, although they do exist. But also they don't pay as close of attention to politics as you and I and people watching this program generally do. And so they're really important, but they're also hard to reach. And they might have sort of political views that, again, the people who pay more attention to politics, they're usually like reliable Democrats or reliable Republicans. The swing voters, they can go either way, and they sometimes have a mix of political beliefs that maybe don't make sense in terms of like where the parties are, but they make sense to those people, and they vote on lots of different issues. One of the things that was a concern about Biden was just that he was too old to do the job, or a lot of people felt that way. Harris has her own set of problems, but she doesn't have that specific problem. So that's at least helpful to the Democrats that Harris is just seen as sort of a more capable, energetic person.
When you talk about people who have differing views on things, sometimes they're drawn to third-party candidates. The latest polls show that the third-party candidates, specifically Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Jill Stein, don't appear to be having as big a role in this campaign that some people were worried about. Some people were very concerned about the spoiler roles that either of them could play. Do you think that either of them are going to gain traction and potentially be spoilers?
Well, look, it's still quite possible and actually probable that whatever share of the vote the third-party candidates get in a given state will be larger than the margin of victory for either Harris or Trump in those states. And you particularly think about a Wisconsin that was decided by less than a point in both 2016 and 2020. That said, I think that third-party candidates were sort of poised to play a bigger role in this election, in part because so many voters, maybe 15 to 20% of the electorate, had an unfavorable view of both major party candidates, which was also true in 2016 with the Clinton versus Trump choice. and 6% of the whole electorate voted for Libertarian Gary Johnson, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, or a variety of other options in terms of third parties. But even then, 6% of the electorate voted for third parties. That means 94% stuck with the major party choice. And what we see now is that Trump's favorability is actually a little bit better than it's been in the past. His unfavorability is like 7 or 8 points higher than his favorability, which is not good, but it's also not like a double-digit underwater gap, which is where Trump has been for a lot of time as a major political figure, which is going on a decade now, really, in American politics. And Kamala Harris, her favorability was stuck in the high 30s. Her unfavorability was over 50 when she was, just the running mate. But she's improved that pretty markedly since she became the candidate. Her favorability is still underwater, but generally only like 4 or 5 points. So there are some voters who have an unfavorable view of both candidates, but very relatively few of them, particularly compared to 2016 and where this race was earlier in the cycle. That removes some of the oxygen for the third party voters, because back in 2016, the lion's share of the people who voted third party were the people who had unfavorable views of both candidates, the so-called double haters. There are just fewer of them now. We see it in the polls. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would sometimes hit double digits in polls. Now he's down to more like 5%. And to the extent he's taking support from major party candidates, it's generally hurting Trump a little bit more than Harris, which is not necessarily how it was before. Jill Stein and Cornel West and Chase Oliver, the Libertarian candidate, where they're on the ballot, I feel pretty confident saying they're going to get a percentage point or less. So I would say at this point, I would think the total third party vote will be smaller than it was in 2016, but they'll still be present. But they're definitely just spoilers at this point.
When you talk about favorability and views of candidates, we're still learning about Harris's running mate, Tim Walz from Minnesota, the governor there. And we're also, of course, in Ohio, very familiar with Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. In this week's Crystal Ball, there's this line. It's worth noting that even the home state vice presidential bonus is disputed, let alone some sort of broader regional benefit. We would also question a broader Midwest electoral appeal for the GOP VP nominee, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. You don't think J.D. Vance has broad Midwestern electoral appeal?
I don't, and I wouldn't say that about Tim Walz either. I just don't think that the running mates really matter all that much. Trump, he had this interview a few weeks ago with the National Association of Black Journalists, and he sort of kind of crassly said, hey, running mates don't really matter all that much electorally. I think he was actually right about that. Some of the research backs that up. You can argue that sometimes there could be like a little bit of a home state bonus, but of course, Ohio is not at the center of this election the way that it's been in the past. It would be a big surprise if Donald Trump didn't win Ohio. Likewise, Tim Walz from Minnesota. That's a state that if a Democrat doesn't carry it, they're going to go down and defeat. The Democrats have won Minnesota in every election going back to 1976, although sometimes it's been close. But if Harris needs a little boost from Walz in Minnesota, she's got much bigger problems. And again, I just don't see there being some sort of like special appeal for either Vance or Walz in the Midwest. Vance's rollout, I think it's fair to say, has been rocky. His unfavorability in national polls is higher than his favorability. Walz, I'd say the jury is more out. Part of it is he hasn't been around in the race as long as Vance has been. His numbers are kind of lukewarm. His maybe some polls will say his favorability is slightly higher than his unfavorability. Some of them show it basically mixed. So I just would want to give it more time. And of course, Vance got picked on a Monday and then he was given his convention address on a Wednesday. Walz has this longer lead up to his convention speech the Wednesday of the Democratic convention. So we'll see how that's received. It's always the case. The presidential candidate's speech is the most important, and Kamala Harris will be giving that on Thursday. But ultimately, I just don't think the running mates make that big of a difference.
Let's talk a little bit about Ohio. It used to be a bellwether. You wrote a book about that, as a matter of fact, as an Ohio native. It was a swing state as well. I know Democrats are looking at all these and thinking maybe Ohio is in a position to be either a bellwether or a swing state or both again. Do you see any evidence of that coming forward in any polls?
I don't really think so. There was some New York Times reporting. There was a really great article, I think it was by Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, last weekend, just looking at some of the turmoil in the Trump campaign since Harris got in. And there was a little nugget in there about how some internal Republican polling had Trump presumably leading, but under 50% in Ohio. I don't know if I would make all that much of that. My guess is that Trump would still win Ohio by 5 to 10 points. Maybe it falls a little bit outside of that range, but it was 8 points in both 2016 and 2020. It's kind of like when Biden was really struggling and we were talking about, is like Virginia going to be a swing state in this election? If Ohio were to fall into that position, that would, of course, broadly be really bad for Donald Trump, because if Ohio was really competitive, presumably that would mean Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota were all, clearly going Democratic for president. So I don't really think that that's happening at this point. But Ohio does have a lot of interesting races going on beyond the top of the ticket. Of course, the Senate race, one of the most important in the country. And, for Sherrod Brown, the fewer crossover votes he needs to get, the fewer Trump voters he needs to attract, the better he is, of course.
And that leads right into my next question. Has all of this potentially changed the U.S. Senate race? I mean, Brown has been leading in most polls, what few polls we've seen, but it's a really tight race.
Yeah, and look, I mean, we're in an era where it used to be very common for states to vote for one party for president, the other party for Senate. Ohio had done that on numerous occasions in the past. You think back to like Howard Metzenbaum winning re-election in 1988 pretty easily over a then fairly young George Voinovich, just going way back into the history hutch here. But and that sort of thing used to be a lot more common than it is today. I think Sherrod Brown, I mean, polls indicate he is capable of generating that crossover kind of appeal. It's just that the worry, I think, for Democrats would be that as the presidential race kind of solidifies, Moreno rises up to meet Trump where he's at in the polls, and maybe Brown isn't able to get that kind of crossover support. Brown seems to be holding his own based on the public numbers that we have, but I think it's still pretty clearly a toss-up kind of race.
And that certainly explains why Senator Sherrod Brown has been saying he's not going to go to the Democratic convention. You have other candidates in the congressional races that are tight. Marcy Kaptur, Amelia Sykes kind of distancing themselves a little bit from what was Biden, now potentially distancing themselves from Harris.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a classic story. When you're an office holder in a district or a state that doesn't necessarily favor your party for president, you want to localize the race, and the other party wants to nationalize the race. I think we saw that was a very obvious kind of theme of the Tim Ryan, J.D. Vance race in 2022. Tim Ryan, I think, performed pretty honorably in that race, given how the rest of the ticket went. Republicans won the other races in the state by much more convincing margins than Vance did. Of course, Ryan was also the strongest Democratic candidate on the entire ticket that year too, the Democratic statewide ticket in 2022. But Kaptur is running in a district that Donald Trump won for president. Amelia Sykes is running in a district that Joe Biden won, but only by a few points. Sherrod Brown will definitely have to carry both of those congressional districts in order to win statewide. And in fact, just carrying them may not be enough for him to win statewide. So I think that for those House members, they want their numbers to look more like Brown's numbers than they probably do Harris's numbers, although Harris probably would at least carry Ohio 13, the Akron-Canton seat that Amelia Sykes is running in, given that Biden won it as well.
Ohioans will also be voting on a redistricting amendment to change the whole process of drawing lawmakers' district lines after several years of litigation over the congressional and legislative district maps. Do you think that will have any effect on the race? And what do you think it would have an effect if it does?
In a presidential year, you expect the presidential election to drive the turnout. And so I don't necessarily think there are going to be people coming out to vote on redistricting who would already be coming out to vote for president. It is ultimately kind of a niche issue, even though it's a really important issue. How the lines are drawn really can help determine the size of majorities and determine whether the minority party, in this case the Democrats, would have a shot of winning a state legislative majority at some point in the coming years. Although even on the maps that this commission would draw, you'd expect Republicans to still be favored in the state legislature, just maybe not quite to the large extent that they are now. But ballot issues there's not great research that indicates that they really drive turnout. Again, particularly in a presidential year. Kind of the classic example of that from Ohio is the same-sex marriage ban that voters approved in 2004. And Republicans wanted that on the ballot. I mean, of course, people's opinions about same-sex marriage were way different and way more conservative 20 years ago than they are now. But there was this sort of suggestion at the time that, oh, well, Bush won Ohio because gay marriage was on the ballot. And that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny in terms of the research that was done after the election. And Ohio, for lack of, I mean, actually, this is kind of a wonky inside baseball way of looking at it. But in the book I wrote about Ohio, I know, Kerry actually, by historical standards, John Kerry actually performed pretty well in Ohio in 2004. Which doesn't suggest that Republicans had some sort of an unnatural advantage or something in the state because of the ballot issue. So I don't know necessarily what the prospects of the redistricting issue are, but I don't necessarily think it has a bearing on the other races. Now, if it passes and there are new maps, that of course has bearing on the state legislature and the congressional maps for 2026 and beyond.
And finally, overall, what's your feel of this race? Is it feeling like 2016, 2020, 2008? Does it have its own feel? I mean, do you get any signs that of nostalgia in looking around at what's been happening overall?
I do really just think it's sort of the end of the Trump trilogy. I guess if he loses, maybe he runs again in 2028. But he's the through line for all of these elections, and Trump has had a tremendous effect on American politics and the way that people vote. He has changed his changing of America's political coalitions has changed the political map. Again, Ohio was this bellweather state, maybe had a slight Republican lean before Trump at the federal level. Now it has a more significant Republican lean. The same thing is true of Iowa. Meanwhile, a state like Virginia, a state like Georgia, a state like Arizona, those states have become less Republican, and in the case of Virginia, actually Democratic leaning. There was this trade-off in the electorate that Trump helped to sort of accelerate. And so again, I think we're 2024 to me is just another version of these Trump elections.
Sabato's crystal ball has Ohio as a toss-up in the U.S. Senate race and as a safe Republican state in the presidential contest. Republicans have won more than 80% of statewide elections since 1990.